Hello everyone, this is the story of my life. My name is Kang, and I'm a person with yin and yang eyes who can see ghosts. Perhaps that's why I appear a little odd. I was walking down the street that day, as usual, and I looked this way and then the other. People on the street always looked at me with puzzled expressions, but I was used to it. Some people also asked what I was doing, but I couldn't tell them that I was the only one who could see things that others couldn't. Because my vision were different from everyone else's, few people realized that there were countless number of ghosts all around us. The majority of them were unjust ghosts killed by accidents or other reasons. For further information, I am 27 years old and single. I had girlfriends in the past, but we ended up breaking up because of my unique abilities, mostly. And as for the things that only I could see, I had known them for a long time, so I was not afraid when I happened to see them. I saw and passed by them every day. This ability of mine was not innate. To explain why I have this special ability, it all stemmed from an illness that struck me when I was 17 years old. The illness struck quickly and unexpectedly. My teacher took me to the hospital after I fainted during class. I had a high fever. My doctor examined me numerous times, but my disease had no obvious symptoms. The doctor and my parents were both concerned as a result of this. The high fever lasted a few days and then vanished, but I was still hospitalized for a few days more. Apart from lying in the hospital bed and feeling a little weak, I didn't feel any discomfort in the last few days. I wandered outside in the hallway every day because I was bored in bed. Suddenly, I noticed some strange people walking among the patients. Their surroundings appeared to be shrouded in black smoke, and they all appeared pale and hazy. I'd purposefully walked past these people, but even when they were so close, I couldn't see their faces. What was stranger was that I saw a shadowy figure of a man walking into the wall with my own eyes. I was quite surprised. How could such a thing happen? I couldn't believe what I'd seen. I dashed up to the wall, touched it, knocked on it, and I was certain it was a wall. When I told the doctor about this, he suspected that the prolonged high fever had affected my optic nerve and recommended me to see an ophthalmologist. The doctor told me that I was fine and asked me if I had recently taken any medication. Perhaps the hallucinations you are seeing are due to medication side effects. Your eyes are totally fine, the doctor said. These symptoms caused my hospital discharge to be delayed. I couldn't sleep that night, so I went to the corridor to enjoy the night view. I casted a long glance into the darkness. A strange feeling appeared in me, a feeling that sent chills down my spine, and a little girl was quietly walking past me. This piqued my interest. It was after 11 p.m. It was odd that a little girl appeared in the deserted hallway at this hour, and she appeared hazy. She walked quietly past me, making no sound. The girl walked quietly to a hallway corner, then proceeded to the stairwell that led to the rooftop. This piqued my interest even more, and I sped up to catch up with her and made sure I was correct. That girl walked through that door. I kept following that girl. I was watching her open the door and stepped into the terrace. A fear and anxiety rose in my heart at this moment, and I dashed after her. I was afraid she was in danger, so I took a few more steps up to the roof. Normally, the security guards would lock the door here, but I was not sure why it wasn't locked that time. The light on the terrace was poor, and the area was small. The young girl stood by the terrace railing, and another woman was standing nearby her. A strange woman was holding a child in her arms and speaking to the other child. Even though I was only a few feet away, I could only see her mouth move but not hear what she was saying. She just stood there with lifeless eyes, listening to the other woman telling her something. The little girl climbed onto the balcony railing after the woman said a few words. This unexpected action caused me to break out in a cold sweat. Did the woman incite the young girl to commit suicide by jumping? I was stunned for a moment because she was standing on the railing, which was extremely dangerous. I didn't have time to think about what was going on, so I rushed to stop her. Hey, come down, girl! It's dangerous! She, on the other hand, ignored my words and threw herself down. When I noticed this, I dashed over. I reached out and hugged her just in time. But what I didn't expect was that instead of capturing and holding her in my arms, all I now had was a thin puff of air. I rushed forward so quickly due to inertia that I almost fell from the top of the building. I was scared and my calves constricted. At this point, I suddenly remembered the old woman holding the child, and I forced myself to calm down and look for her. I couldn't see their legs because she was carrying the baby and heading to the door. To be more precise, she and the baby were floating towards the door. When they arrived at the door, she abruptly turned her head and glared at me. Their faces were not human at all, but rather a very creepy, sinewy face. She hugged the child and went inside the door after glaring at me. The door then slammed shut. The nurse came in the next morning while I was still in the room. I asked her about a young girl with long hair who was dressed in hospital clothes. The nurse informed me that there was a little girl in the area where I was staying who looked exactly like what I described, but she was terminally ill and died last night. So what I saw had to be a ghost of the little girl, but what happened to the woman who was holding the child? When I told my parents about the strange things I had seen, they invited Mr. Zhu, a shaman, to come and have a look for me. Mr. Zhu examined my condition before asking me detailed questions about the hazy silhouettes I saw. Mr. Zhu pondered for a moment before telling my father, "This young man has celestial eyes and can see ghosts." My father requested Mr. Zhu to find a solution because his words terrified my parents, and they begged him to find a way to save me. He told me that the woman I saw on the terrace with the other child was looking for a replacement for her child, and that I should hide away. My parents recognized the seriousness of the situation and agreed to let me go to the temple, following what he said. I was at the temple for 7 days before Mr. Zhu and my parents arrived to pick me up. He claimed to have settled the concern of the ghost mother and her baby. He gave me a pair of sunglasses that he claimed he custom made. I couldn't see those things anymore because I was wearing these sunglasses. I used to wear them every day, but now I took them off every now and then to see the spiritual world. Only I could see that world, the world of souls. It should be noted that since I had this ability, I was also concerned about random things. I was following a ghost on that particular day. I was not sure why the police station attracted so many ghosts. Of course, in order to see those ghosts, I had to remove these glasses. Today was the 30th day since I passed by here for the first time and saw the ghost of a girl standing still. I tried to find out what she was up to out of curiosity. Everything was motivated by curiosity, but it could also be a fateful arrangement. I was still speculating about her motives when someone behind tapped me on the shoulder and asked, "What are you doing here?" "I've been noticing you for a few days. Why are you snooping in front of the police station?" "Do you have a problem?" said the police officer. I replied, "Nothing," because I didn't want to reveal anything about myself to the others, nor did I want to cause trouble for myself, so I rushed out of there. I initially observed her for a few days just to satisfy my curiosity, but I abandoned this plan due to the appearance of the police. So I purposefully accompanied her when she left. The intention was to get a good look at her. The first thing that came to my mind was that she had been murdered by someone. There was a wound on the side of her head. Perhaps she wanted to go to the police station and ask for help because she died unjustly. I was not sure if the cop noticed my odd expression, but I quickly left. Then one day, as I was walking home, I noticed the same police officer smoking a cigarette beneath my house. He'd been waiting for me. It was not difficult for a cop to figure out where I live. He saw me, held a cigarette in his hand, took a few puffs, and then extinguished the cigarette with his foot. He approached me and called me out by name. "Hello, Mr. Kang. My name is Jiro. I have a few questions for you." I knew why he came here, but I didn't want to bother myself with it, so I ignored him. I admired his foresight. He might discover that I'd been loitering in front of the police station for 3 days and detected the information about me. I still ignored him and went upstairs, but he asked if I could assist him. It turned out that he was aware of the history of the glasses I was wearing. I asked him whether, as a cop, he believed in ghosts or not. "I've learned about these things, and I'm aware of the effect of the glasses you're wearing, of course. I believe there are ghosts in this world," he said. When I heard that, I quickly invited him in. When I politely invited him in to sit and pour him a glass of water, he stopped circling and went straight to the point. He inquired as to what I saw in front of the police station. His voice seemed to recognize what I was seeing, and he really figured out why I always wore sunglasses. He claimed that I wore sunglasses to avoid staring at those things. He stated that he had previously communicated with people who possess such special abilities, and he witnessed my reaction. I was not sure if he actually met or if he said it to relieve my stress. I hesitated before telling him the truth. My eyes were distinct from those of others. I removed my sunglasses and informed him that I could see ghosts. He didn't seem surprised, but just sat there and listened to what I had to say. I told him about how I saw the female ghost 3 days ago standing in front of the police station. When I was finished, he abruptly stood up and asked me to accompany him to the police station. He wanted me to investigate whether a victim who went missing last week was her. So in order to assist the police, I immediately agreed. However, I doubted why a police officer would place such a high level of trust in me. Still, there was the ghost. I walked past her and went into the police station. When I arrived, I was surprised to know that the police officer appeared young but was a superior here. He led me into his office, turned on the computer and looked up something. I had a look in it. They were all previously reported missing people. He opened a page of young girls and asked if there were any girls who looked like the girl standing at the gate. He thought the girl I saw had something to do with the case, as I suspected. I quickly recalled the girl's appearance and compared it to the list. Just then I noticed one of the missing girls standing at the door. I simply showed him. "Are you certain it's this girl? Her family reported her missing a week ago," he said. Then he asked if I could communicate with ghosts. Actually, I've been attempting this for quite some time. I could only see them but couldn't communicate with them. Then Police Officer Jiro approached me and asked if the girl was still present. I removed my sunglasses and noticed the girl standing in front of him. I purposefully lowered my voice and informed him that he and the girl were almost face to face. As a result, he was both surprised and concerned. But he quickly calmed down and asked me to describe the little girl to him. I was a little scared because the girl's appearance was a little frightening, but I took a step closer and looked at her. And when I told him what I saw, he took a notebook and jotted it all down. In addition to the large dent on the girl's forehead, a string was also attached to the girl's wrist. He repeated every sentence I said and wrote it down on his notebook. The girl's feet were caked in mud. I took a good look at the girl and told him everything I saw. Her clothes had some weeds on them. I was about to put my glasses on when I noticed that the girl's clothes were stained with a lot of water. I was worried that something might be missing, so I double-checked to be sure before putting on my glasses. Sunken brow, calloused wrists, muddied hands and feet, a water fern stuck in her body. The cop looked at the notebook, mumbled something about the clues, and then abruptly turned around and told me to get into the car and follow him to visit some place. The clues found from the ghost indicated that I could tell she had been murdered, and I wanted to help her, so I got into the police car. He drove me to a nearby river and dropped me off. He took some mud for me to compare to the mud on the body. When he brought some water ferns up for me to look at, the color and shape of the water ferns reminded me of the ones on the girl's body. He made a call and requested some people be dispatched to this river area following my confirmation. Soon after, a large number of police cars arrived and the cops stretched the ropes all over the place. There was also a group of men in diving suits joining the investigation. After some time, the rescue team extracted a woman's body from under the water, and the appearance of the dead woman's corpse matched exactly what I had seen. Her forehead had a deep dent. Her hands were shackled with a rope. A week later, police officer Jiro invited me to dinner. He thanked me for assisting him in solving the case, but he didn't say much about it other than it was a robbery. I was overjoyed at the time, perhaps because I had helped that girl and because the police had placed their trust in me. That day I felt very at ease and talked a lot with him. He requested that I remove my sunglasses. Perhaps because he drank too much, he lost his old solemn expression and said, "Your sunglasses look weird." I removed my sunglasses. Honestly, it gave me the impression that the food was all the same color and no longer tasty. But as soon as I removed my glasses, I noticed something. Jiro asked me sensitively if I had seen anything. He followed my gaze to the table that was empty. With a curious tone in his voice, he inquired as to what was wrong with that empty chair over there. I assured him that everything was fine because I was wearing sunglasses and wasn't used to taking them off. And I kept talking to him. I just wanted to have a casual meal with my police officer friend in the most natural way possible. After I finished my meal, I decided to look into the strange ghost I had seen in the dinner on my own. I noticed a ghost walking down a dark alley. I may have noticed him because he was different from the other things I saw. His entire body was as black as ink, like coal. I was guessing he died in a fire. He wandered around the narrow alley for a while before turning around and walking down the street. I could see him, but he couldn't see me because he was just passing by me. I could detect a burning odor emanating from the ghost person. I occasionally followed something because I was curious to see what they would do. Every day I continued to pursue him. He strolled down the commercial street to a restaurant and stopped. He just stood there for half an hour looking inside the restaurant before turning around and walking over to the restaurant across the street. I had no idea what he wanted to do until he suddenly bursted out in flames. Yes, he stood in front of the restaurant and it spontaneously exploded on fire, but no one knew. The fire on the ghost's body grew stronger and stronger when he hit the wall with his hand, which slowly burned. When two people ran out of the restaurant, I was about to rush to their aid. They were terrified when they saw the burning wall. They took some water buckets from the restaurant and attempted to stop the fire. The fire had been extinguished, and the man in the apron wiped the water from his clothes, saying something that this was not the first time a fire had occurred. The other man said nothing, but the ghost stood behind him, holding out his burning hand towards them. However, the ghost's hand passed directly through the man's body, causing no harm to him. Unsure if he could feel anything, he turned his head to look behind him. He turned his head and saw nothing, but instead stared right at me. Then I noticed him removing an amulet from his neck. The amulet appeared to have a different effect, causing the ghost to vanish quickly. The both of them walked into the restaurant. I looked over to the restaurant across the street, thinking there might be some information about him. I went into the restaurant, perhaps because it was too late. There were no customers and only the old owner was cleaning.
"Hello, please sit down. What would you like to eat?"
said the elderly owner. I was really hungry, so I ordered a bowl of noodles right away. Then he held into the kitchen and asked for a bowl of noodles for me. I took advantage of the time when the noodles hadn't been ready yet by finding a topic to discuss with the boss. During our conversation, the owner mentioned that there was someone who had burned to death in this restaurant, so he purchased it for a very low price. He also told me about what had happened in this restaurant previously. He said that the previous owner had a family of 3 and his cooking skills were also very good. Everything was going fine, but then something tragic happened. A large fire broke out one night after the entire family had gone to bed. The fire was so intense that all 3 members of the family were unable to escape in time and were burned to death. Because the shop had a dead person, no one dared to rent it back for a long time, and it was eventually abandoned. Later he rented it. He was not superstitious about haunted houses, and despite doing well, the restaurant across the street always caused trouble to them. After hearing the boss's story, I picked up the phone and dialed. I'd like to report this incident and seek assistance from the police officer Jiro. This case had previously been handled by Jiro, and the final conclusion at the time was that the restaurant was careless and thus the fire occurred. John was the owner of the restaurant across the street. Officer Jiro summoned John after hearing my accusations, but he insisted that he was not involved. When Jiro informed me that there was insufficient evidence to convict him, he asked if there was any way to deal with the ghost. At that moment, I was thinking of Mr. Zhu, who gave me a special pair of glasses. I called Mr. Zhu with police officer Jiro's approval. After hearing what I had to say, Mr. Zhu agreed to assist. I asked him to meet me at the back of the police station, and he handed me something to give to the police officer Jiro. It was an amulet box. Police Jiro had no doubts about Mr. Zhu's claims, despite the fact that Jiro's words were not good to do so, but his face was filled with excitement. Jiro entered the station and I joined Mr. Zhu behind the building. Mr. Zhu was waiting there. We were not far from the interrogation room. Mr. Zhu asked me to step aside. He was holding something between his 2 index fingers. Then he drew a talisman on the wall and declared that he would allow the ghost to enter. Mr. Zhu then told me to ask the policeman Jiro to get the amulet that was around Yun's neck after he drew the symbol. I went to the interrogation room and told Jiro about Mr. Zhu's words. Jiro entered the interrogation room and asked Yun a few questions about the amulet he was wearing. "God can't help you if you do anything that harms other people," said Police Officer Jiro. During his speech, he examined the amulet Yun was wearing on his hand. Mr. Zhu had smeared a kind of drug on Jiro's hand. After the interrogation, Jiro made John think twice about declaring truthfully. Then Jiro walked out. Jiro and I stood outside the interrogation room awaiting the outcome. Following that, a ghost appeared behind John, and it was the burning ghost. John noticed that ghost was behind him and he appeared terrified. But he had nowhere to go, so he could only let the fire consume him. Yun cried out in agony as he was surrounded by flames. It took less than a minute for the man to scream for help at the door, declaring that he was going to confess everything that he had done, everything, and that he had set the family on fire. I got the desired result. Police Officer Jiro returned to the interrogation room and I called Mr. Zhu and told him everything was fine. Officer Jiro looked at me before entering the door and asked me to accompany Mr. Zhu. Mr. Zhu was waiting behind the building when I returned and asked how everything was going. I assured him that everything was fine. I gave a brief explanation of what had occurred, and seeing some ash-like debris floating in front of me, I knew Mr. Zhu helped release the ghost. He told me he was going where he needed to go, then returned and invited me to his house. When he heard that I had helped a female ghost in a case, he said it was an action of virtue. Punishing the crime, he hoped that I would be able to use my abilities to help more people. Hello, my name is Kang. I have yin-yang eyes that allow me to see things that most people cannot. I saw the ghost of a child at the crossroads that day. He just sat there, oblivious to the passing traffic. The boy's body and face were covered in wounds. He looked so pitiful. I guessed he died in a car accident. He still didn't seem to realize he was dead, but just stood there and watched the traffic go by. There were still many bloodstains on the road where the child was standing if you look closely. I couldn't explain why, but all I wanted to do was help him. However, I couldn't communicate with him. I needed to find someone to assist me. Mr. Zhu was the person who could assist me. I took a taxi to his house. Mr. Zhu was very nice to me and always agreed to use his talents for good. When I told Mr. Zhu about the child I saw at the crossroads, he immediately said, "It's a soul trapped in the ground." I was surprised by the phrase, trapped soul. It was the first time I'd heard about it and had no idea what soul trapped in the ground meant. Simply put, when a person dies, his or her soul is imprisoned in that location, unable to leave. He was drinking tea and explained it to me. He added, "If he wants to be free, he needs a family member to call his name and leads him out of the place where he died. This is known as soul summoning." The phrase soul summoning surprised me also. Mr. Zhu took a sip of tea and stated that many people who died were unaware that they were dead, that their souls were barely conscious, and that they frequently wandered in the same place. That was why people burned paper at the scene of an accident. They would always wander there if no family members came for them. According to Mr. Zhu, the boy had no family to summon his soul, and he was stuck there. I wanted to help him, but I didn't know how to find the child's family, or perhaps I just contacted the police or asked around. Mr. Zhu drank up the tea and reminded me that I could ask the police officers whom I knew for assistance, and taught me the method of soul summoning before leaving. I didn't think twice. I made a phone call to Jiro, a police officer. After leaving Mr. Zhu's house and briefly explained what had happened, Mr. Zhu was correct. After a few phone calls, Jiro found the boy's home address. I went to the address given to me by Jiro and found the boy's home. I was considering how to inform his family about this along the way so that there would be no misunderstandings. I couldn't think of a nice word after considering everything. For about 10 minutes, I stood in front of the boy's house. Finally, I knocked and got ready to tell the truth. I knew I had found the right home when the person who opened the door was a woman in her 30s with a very sad face. Despite my mental preparation, I hesitated when the woman asked where I was from. I did not respond to her main question, but I said that I had seen her son. She was surprised, as I expected. But she didn't think I was crazy and invited me in. Her husband also came out and they invited me to sit down. I noticed a picture on the table. The boy in the picture was the same one I saw at the crossroads. After I sat down, the woman asked where I had seen her son and how he was doing. She appeared to be aware of something. I briefly mentioned my ability to see ghosts, and then I told them about the boy I saw at the crossroads. The mother covered her mouth with her hand and tears flowed when she heard what I said. However, the father calmly told me about his son. The kid's name was Peng, and he joined the school's basketball team just a week ago. Peng's mother also took him to a sportswear store to purchase basketballs. Peng tripped, the basketball rolled down the street, and he chased after it. Peng ran out in the middle of the road, and because the incident happened so quickly that she didn't have time to stop him. And the horrible accident happened right in front of her eyes. Peng's father held back tears as he told the entire story while Peng's mother sobbed. Several days after his death, Peng's mother had recurring dreams in which Peng was standing in the dark and asked her to find him. Peng appeared to be in a bad mood as he claimed he had no idea where he was. He was freezing, hot and lonely. Peng's mother woke frequently and cried even while sleeping. As a result, when I mentioned meeting Peng, They were unsurprised. I told them about Peng's situation and Mr. Zhu's treatment method. They agreed to use that method to get Peng back. Mr. Zhu provided me the tools I needed for soul summoning, and when I left his house he gave me 2 bells and a piece of red gauze. I asked Peng's mother to cut on her finger and take some blood according to that method. That was referred to as a blood connection, and a bell dripping blood can lead Peng home. Everything was in order. I stayed at Peng's house until 12 o'clock, at which point we hailed a cab and drove straight to the intersection where Peng was discovered. Mr. Zhu advised soul callers to cover their eyes with red gauze from beginning to end because some people with special abilities will see other things during the process. We quickly exited the car at the intersection, and Peng's father assisted Peng's mother to the center of the intersection. Peng's parents were still obsessed by the accident and had no return to the intersection since. Peng's mother couldn't help but tremble and cry, so I urged them to start summoning souls right away. As I spoke, Peng's mother shook the bell in her hand, calling Peng every 9 steps to come home with her. I removed my glasses as I heard her voice choked on the gloomy night. The mother kept repeating herself, "Peng, Peng, return home with me." Peng's father and I followed her for a short distance. The first was to ensure Peng's mother's safety, and the second was to show her the way. In this way, it aided Peng in leaving that place of soul lockedness and returning home. Mr. Zhu instructed me to draw a circle at Peng's feet. Mr. Zhu explained that this was done to keep other children from causing problems in their home. Peng's mother suddenly inquired if she could see Peng again. I really wanted to help her see the child again, but I couldn't. All I could do was tell her that Peng was standing in the circle right now, and she rushed over after hearing me say that. I was not sure how she could see Peng at that moment, or if it was just a coincidence. She was actually holding Peng in her arms. I think it was a mother's hunch. But just for a while, Mr. Zhu stated that after the spirits were summoned, they had to go where they needed to go. As I watched Peng vanish like dust in his mother's arms, I told them that Peng would no longer suffer, that I had done what I should have done, and turned to leave. The husband bowed to express his gratitude. I believed they could finally have peace of mind accepting the truth that their son had gone in peace. I felt like a superhero when I used my power to help others. It appeared that becoming a shaman was also very appealing. After experiencing the preceding events, I was extremely grateful to Mr. Zhu and greatly admired him. I became increasingly interested in what he said about yin and yang, so I bombarded him with questions about ghosts and gods. "You should try this tea first, because as a shaman you must know how to drink tea," Mr. Zhu said. I was not a tea person, but after I finished my cup, I inquired about the yin realm with Mr. Zhu. Mr. Zhu did not continue talking about it. Instead, he took a sip of his tea and announced that a customer was on his way. There was a knock on the door as soon as Mr. Zhu finished speaking. Mr. Zhu seemed to have anticipated a visitor and rose to open the door. A middle-aged man with a bald head led the way, followed by a strong man who appeared to be the bald man's bodyguard. I learned from their stories that the skin-headed Cheng owned a construction company and was very wealthy. He went to see Mr. Zhu this time because he needed assistance. He claimed that the mansion he had just purchased was haunted. He stated that when he was about to renovate the house, the workers informed him that there was a problem, but he assumed it was because they were requesting a price increase, so he ignored their words. So he didn't bother redecorating and simply moved in. Mr. Zhu listened to Mr. Cheng's story quietly. Mr. Zhu, on the other hand, asked Mr. Cheng to get right to the point. As a result, Mr. Cheng began to speak about the strange events that occurred in that house. Mr. Cheng had recently lost his wife and was now living alone. but on his first night in the villa, he felt uncomfortable as if the room was extremely cold. This sensation caused him to toss not only from a sense of coldness but also from an unseen sense of oppression. He awoke with heavy, sleepy eyes. The sight in front of him startled him. He saw a female ghost in white dangling from the roof. The ghost charged at him with her hook-like fingers stretched out. Then two terrifying hands with long pointed claws charged at him. Mr. Cheng was strangled by a female ghost, and he desperately wanted to scream but couldn't. He was in panic, so he grabbed the talisman on the bedside table and threw it at the ghost. This talisman was extremely effective, knocking the ghost out of his body. He looked around the room, terrified, after the ghost had vanished. The ghost vanished and the room fell silent. He didn't want to stay at home for too long, so he checked in a hotel and asked Mr. Zhu's contact information for assistance. Mr. Zhu stood up after Mr. Cheng finished speaking and said he would come to his mansion to take a look. Mr. Zhu invited me to accompany him to gain more experience. We climbed into Mr. Cheng's luxury vehicle and the driver whisked us away to a affluent neighborhood where Mr. Cheng was living. It was a large mansion in the middle of a garden. Mr. Cheng invited us in. I was truly impressed by this villa. How much money do I need to save to be able to purchase it? Entering the mansion, Mr. Cheng closed the door and hid behind it, allowing Mr. Zhu to pass through. I followed closely behind, feeling a rush of cold air. Mr. Zhu looked around and then Mr. Cheng dared to enter and asked Mr. Zhu if he noticed anything wrong. Mr. Zhu did not respond but instead said to me, "Kang, take off your glasses and look around to see if there's anything." Mr. Zhu was aware of my abilities, so I removed my glasses and looked around. I noticed a girl in white floating in the air in the corner of the house's roof. Mr. Zhu also appeared to have discovered the yin emitted by the ghost as he raised his head and spoke to the girl in white. He inquired of the girl as to why she was causing such a commotion here. The girl, who now had a terrifying expression on her face, turned and stared directly at Mr. Zhu. She claimed that the owner of this house murdered her and that she was seeking vengeance. She was a college student who had been involved with a rich man for a long time due to a frivolous greed, but she did not expect him to be a brute. Not only did he forbid her from contacting the outside world, but he also abused her after he drank alcohol and strangled her to death during an abuse. Hearing this, my heart skipped a beat, and I turned to face Mr. Cheng. Mr. Cheng denied killing the woman and asked Mr. Zhu to assist him in locating the previous owner of the house in order to put an end to this ordeal. Mr. Zhu stated that no one blamed him and requested Mr. Cheng to find the previous landlord. But Mr. Cheng stated that the landlord had been sentenced to death for bribery and corruption. Mr. Cheng held up the phone to show her a piece of news, which the ghost didn't believe. I also read in the news that this person abused his power and was subsequently convicted of doing wrong. For a while, the white-robed ghost stared blankly, blood and tears flowing from her eyes, and her face was no longer as fierce as it had been. She descended from above the roof. She asked Mr. Zhu what she should do after repeating the words, "Dead? Dead." Mr. Zhu promised to send the girl wherever she needed to go. Mr. Zhu requested that I take the items he was carrying in the car, a wooden sword and a clay pot. Mr. Zhu put the clay pot upside down, brandished a wooden sword and muttered something in his mouth. It had got to be some sort of spell that saved the souls of the dead. Mr. Zhu held open after chanting and poked a hole in the bottom of the clay pot with a wooden sword. Then I noticed something amazing. The hole in the clay pot was emitting cold air, and I could still hear the howls of ghosts and spirits. It was as if the black hole in the clay basin was linked to hell. Just as I was about to say something, the girl in the white transformed into a white light and was sucked into the black hole. The ghosts and howls vanished when the girl in white was sucked away. Mr. Zoo instructed me to handle the clay pot with care. It was now just an earthen pot with a hole in the bottom and fragments on the ground. When everything was finished, Mr. Cheng thanked Mr. Zoo and requested that the driver take Mr. Zoo and me home. I couldn't help but wonder what about the girl in white along the way. Mr. Zoo noticed my perplexity and stated that the girl in white had been transformed by resentment and her obsession with vengeance had deepened. For her, the only sense that can exist was vengeance, which was why she had no idea where to go. Mr. Zoo sighed, saying that ghosts, like humans, harbor hatred in their hearts, and that even if they forget the appearance of the enemy, they couldn't give up hatred and were haunted and dominated by it. Mr. Zoo's emotions made me think that his life might be full of stories, and I even imagined him as a teacher. At the time, I was witness to a series of strange events that caused me to reflect on the world around me. In my spare time, I went to a lake near my house to unwind. There was no manager at this location, and there were frequently people fishing and swimming. When I arrived at the lake, there were some children playing and swimming in the water. I wore sunglasses every day and the world was the same color in my eyes. After a while, I got used to seeing those things, so I wanted to take off my sunglasses and enjoy the beauty. However, as soon as I removed my sunglasses, I noticed something that made me jump. Not far from the children, there was half a person's head in the water. Looking closer, I realized it was a water ghost drowning in the lake. As I remembered Mr. Zoo telling me about the water ghost taking a substitute. The water ghost leaned quietly toward one of the children. That child was chosen as the target. It gave a creepy grin before diving into the water. I knew it was going to drag the target underwater, so I howled at the kids to hurry to shore because there was danger in the water. But those kids didn't believe me. Because those kids were obstinate, I knelt to pick up a few stones from the ground. I hurled them at those children. I didn't mean to hurt them. All I wanted was to get the kids out of the lake as quickly as possible. And this really worked. The kids looked at me with hatred in their eyes. They were terrified and they all left. The kids turned to look at me and said, "Huh? Looking handsome and tall, who would have thought he was crazy?" Regardless of what a few children said, I turned my head and gazed into the water. The water ghost poked its head out of the water, angry eyes fixed on me. He eventually sank to the bottom and vanished. Mr. Zoo stated that the water ghost drew people to reincarnate earlier, and that I ruined his good work in order to save people, but the monstrosity stayed with me. That day, I went to a public bath near my house. I went early in the morning because there were fewer people and the water was clean. I napped in the heated swimming pool, which was very pleasant. I was taking a dip in the hot pool, but the soles of my feet were getting cold. I couldn't rest because of the cold. I looked down at the pool. My breath was hot, nothing out of the ordinary. I was about to unwind and take a nap when I felt my ankle being dragged into the water by a powerful force. I slipped and sank into the pool completely defenseless. I could feel myself being drawn into the water. I opened my eyes. The water temperature was over 40 degrees. My eyes were very painful and I couldn't see a water ghost hugging my ankle. I didn't expect to see him here. I tried to get out of the water, but he clung to me. He charged at me with a ferocious expression. I drank a few sips of hot water before kicking my feet to the bottom and jumping out of the water. I took a deep breath and looked down at the water, wondering if he was still there. But the water in the pool was very clear. I could clearly see the bottom. There was nothing but me in the pool. I quickly changed into my clothes and exited the bathroom. I called Mr. Zhu, but he was out of town and wouldn't be back for a few days. The water ghost would like to take me as his substitute. Over the phone, Mr. Zhu showed me how to save my life. I returned home and went to the local grocery to get a large sheet of plastic. According to Mr. Zhu, I nailed it to the ceiling. Mr. Zhu asked me to nail the plastic sheet's corner to the wall. I was not sure what this was for, but Mr. Zhu said it was used to deal with water ghosts. That night, unable to sleep, I lied in bed staring at the plastic sheet on the roof. But it was still the same. I didn't remember when I fell asleep. I vaguely heard the sound of running water in the room because I didn't sleep well. The sound was coming from the roof, but the house I was living in never had a water leak, so I opened my eyes to see what was watering. But my eyelids were heavy, and as I struggled to open my eyes, I noticed water dripping on the roof's plastic sheet. I wanted to get up and check, but my body wouldn't move at all. I think I was sleep deprived. The water ghost might have tracked me down. The sound of rushing water became increasingly louder. The plastic sheet on the roof quickly accumulated a large amount of water, and a large hole fell. I couldn't move. I couldn't do anything. All I could do was squint. The water in the plastic sheet gradually formed a shape resembling an enraged man. He tried to approach me but was stopped by the plastic sheet and was unable to do so. I could see him attempting to contact me. As the water level rose, it got closer and closer to me. I knew it would be dangerous if it got too close to me, and I was about to give up when a ray of sunlight hit my face. I sat up abruptly, looking up at the water phantom on the roof. However, the roof was nothing more than a plastic sheet. Mr. Zhu's method saved me, but it wasn't over yet. I quickly got up, dressed, and went straight to the market. Following Mr. Zhu's advice, I purchased a big rooster. He stated that the water ghost had only 4 chances of catching a substitute, and if he couldn't catch a replacement, he could be forced to stay in cold water forever. If the water ghost didn't die, I would be punished. The best way to avoid punishment was to find someone to die for me. Mr. Zhu's method was to use a rooster instead, and I dripped my blood on the rooster. In this manner, my yang energy transferred to the rooster, undetectable for the water ghost. I was convinced by Mr. Zhu's words, so I threw the rooster into the water. Perhaps because of the floating feathers, the rooster did not immediately sink into the water, but floated to the surface, where a hand suddenly emerged from the water. The rooster dangled in the water. What I witnessed was truly shocking, and I felt grateful to know an expert like Mr. Zhu who helped me escape danger. The rooster saved my life, and I vowed never to eat chicken again after that. But if it happened again, I would do the same. My name is Kang, and I'm not sure whether I should be happy or sad, because I have yin-yang eyes that can see ghosts. For quite a long time I sat on a park bench that day and just thought if I was like Mr. Zhu to become a shaman. Suddenly there was one girl who probably had been watching me sitting on the bench from the side, so she came and spoke to me. She asked me if I saw anything strange in front of me. Her question was pretty unpredictable, so I didn't know what it meant. She showed me a rope on the ground and asked me whether I could see it move. I was also watching the rope. For what reason? I was confused how to explain it to her. I was thinking about what to say when her mother called her from afar. She was very cute and also very nice. She held her mother's hand, just took a few steps when in a sudden she turned around and said I looked cool when I wear sunglasses. This statement made me think. I returned my attention to the rope on the grass in front of me as I watched her and her mother walk slowly. It was a rope the width of a finger, and it was moving. But there was no wind that day, and the rope appeared to be blown up. There was a young man sitting on the ground playing with his dog. He seemed to feel something strange. The dog barked angrily and made him turn his head to have a look and find a rope on his shoulder. The rope tightened around his neck immediately after it wrapped around his body before he could react. His dog seemed to have witnessed something terrible as well, barking behind the young man. I quickly rose from the bench and removed my sunglasses. I ran to save him immediately. Simultaneously, I reached into my pocket and pulled out a handful of soybeans, specially crafted soybeans using Mr. Zoo's method. When I removed my glasses, I noticed a male ghost tugging on the rope, attempting to strangle the young man. I dashed forward, hurling a handful of soybeans at the ghost. Soybeans pelted him like raindrops, and he hissed in agony in the white smoke. The ghost was stopped because he was in too much pain. He abruptly turned his head, his tongue protruding from his mouth, and looked at me with angry eyes. I rushed to him, not letting him continue to attack, and as I was about to throw the soybeans again, he turned to me and held the rope in his hand. He appeared to be very angry, glaring at me, but it seemed that he realized he had encountered an opponent, so he quickly vanished. I left because I saw the ghost was afraid of me, so I rushed over to help the man up and check on his condition. He rubbed his neck, perplexed by what had occurred. The rope was now falling to the ground as well. After the man and the dog had left, I quickly dialed Mr. Zoo's number and informed him of the ghost that I had seen. Mr. Zoo asked me to visit him at his home because the situation was serious, so I took a taxi there. This was the first time I used soybeans to attack a ghost. I told Mr. Zoo. He laughed heartily and said that the magical soybeans he gave were extremely beneficial to me. Mr. Zoo also stated that I frequently encountered these things as a result of my destiny. I asked Mr. Zoo why that ghost attempted to kill innocent people on purpose. Mr. Zoo stated that the ghost had been hung. This lost soul was looking for someone to accompany him. He pulled out his phone and showed it to me. I only took a quick glance at it and was astounded by the contents in the phone. That was the news he gathered. The subject was suicide by hanging, and the deaths of those people were strange. I realized that the few people who had committed suicide had nothing to do with the hanged ghost I'd seen. After I experienced a few things before, a thought occurred to me. That ghost would undoubtedly return to find me. Mr. Zoo had the same idea. He didn't think I'd come across those things by chance, so he gave me some things and demonstrated how to use it. I took what Mr. Zoo had given me and left his house. I was supposed to take the bus home, but I decided to walk because I had the feeling that I'd face the ghost again. I walked a few streets before turning into an empty alley. I slowed down and carefully observed the movement around me. There were some ropes hanging on the alley wall that seemed to sway in the wind as I passed by. But I knew it wasn't the wind because I saw the ropes approaching me like snakes through my glasses. Not only that, but the electrical wires scattered in the trash cans on the ground crawled to my feet like snakes. So I came to a halt and put my hands on my belt. My neck and legs became entangled with electrical wires in an instant. I took the items on my belt that Mr. Zoo had given me. One was called the Whip of Soul. I wasn't sure why it was called this, but it was a necklace made of red rope and a lot of coins. The ropes wrapped around my neck were becoming increasingly tight, so I grabbed the Whip of Soul and smacked them. The Whip of Soul made an explosion when it came into contact with the rope. The rope on the right had been bumped and it hung like a lifeless body, so I waved the Whip of Soul and smacked the rope on the left. When I hit it, the wire was smoking black, as if something had come out of it. In front of my eyes, the black smoke slowly condensed into human form. I knew it was the hanging ghost who appeared. So I removed my glasses and there he was, standing in front of me. I was a little scared when I saw him from the front. When you see the ghost's eyes bulge high, his tongue swollen and the indentation on his neck, you might get goosebumps. The ghost roared into the sky, his white eyes widening, and he looked dreadful. All the ropes and small thread-like things in the alley flew towards me as he roared. I didn't dare to be careless, using all of my strength to grasp the whip of soul in my hand, knocking the flying rope and sending it to the ground. I was enraged by my way of fighting. I wasn't sure what the ghost would do next as it stared at me with raised eyes. The whip of soul in my hand had broken and the coins were all over the place. Only the red rope tied the coins in my hand, and the hanged ghost transformed into a black smoke and entered the red rope. The red rope twisted and wrapped around my neck several times. Then I was squeezed and I could feel the ghost tightening the rope behind me, but I dropped my terrified expression and smiled unconsciously instead. There was a crackling sound from the red rope and an aura spreading throughout the ghost's body like electric current. Those auras were like a net enveloping the ghost's body. He was hit hard, his face hurt. He wanted to get out but couldn't. In an instant the ghost began to fade, and I was successful in destroying him. The ghost vanished in an instant, transformed into black smoke. I understood now what Mr. Zhu meant when he said a soul was scattered. I knelt to pick up the scattered coins, stood up, and exited the alley. Perhaps it was because I had wiped out the hanged ghost, or perhaps it was simply admiration of Mr. Zhu's knowledge, but there was an unexplainable uneasiness in my heart. When I left Mr. Zhu's house, he gave me the whip of soul, strung with the enchanted Emperor's coins. If a hanged ghost clung to a rope and attempted to take my life, I could use the whip of soul to beat his spirit. Although I was a bit scared, I smashed the ghost following Master Zhu's instructions, and when I got rid of the hanging ghost, I felt like I had superpowers. I went back to the park bench the next day. I also attempted to let go of the psychological burden from the previous night. I met a little girl and complimented her hairpin on how lovely it was, but it didn't seem to be as simple as I had hoped, as her mother quickly took the little girl away from me. The little girl said that I looked very weird. Many people seemed to regard me as eccentric and unapproachable as a result of my long isolation. Maybe I should stay alone and hide everything behind sunglasses. That afternoon, I returned to the old owner's restaurant from the day before. The noodles here were delicious. My phone rang with a message before I could finish my bowl of noodles. It was sent by Police Officer Jiro, and when I told him where I was, he told me to meet him at a nearby street corner. There might have been something urgent that prompted Officer Jiro to come looking for me. I guess there was a new case. We agreed to meet in 10 minutes, and he said that he'd be there to pick me up and take me to the street. I was waiting for him. Then a car stopped in front of me, and Police Officer Jiro told me to get in.
"Hurry! I have a complicated case. Please assist me,"
said Jiro. I was surprised and asked if this case had anything to do with the devil. So Jiro said that the police investigation into this case had come to an impasse. He would take me to a murder scene to investigate, and perhaps I would be able to assist him. The car drove towards the city's outskirts. I'd been there before, and it was a gathering spot for migrants. According to Jiro, due to the complicated situation of illegal immigration, there were frequent criminal cases in this area. Jiro had just turned his car into a narrow alley. Jiro parked in front of a house, which I assumed was the crime scene. I followed Police Officer Jiro out of the car. This was my first time entering a crime scene. Jiro approached me, pulled a handheld flashlight from his belt, opened the door and stepped inside. This is the crime scene. All 3 people in the village have been killed, Police Officer Jiro said as he shined a light inside. It was quite cold inside, and I could feel a lot of yin moving around. I saw signs. A victim killed in bed based on what I observed from the crime scene. Police ruled out murder and robbery because no property was lost, though there appeared to be traces of ransacking throughout the house. The killer killed 3 people in an instant after 3 people showed signs of a minor struggle. After telling me briefly about the case, Police Officer Jiro motioned for me to remove my glasses and look around. I was about to remove my glasses when I heard a noise from the room inside. Police Officer Jiro passed by and stood in front of me to protect me. Leaning back, he quickly drew the gun from his belt. A black cat jumped out of the room and slipped out the door as soon as I walked up to it. Officer Jiro raised his gun and entered a back room. I followed him. It was a room that resembled a warehouse. I decided to start looking for clues in this room, so I removed my sunglasses. Jiro inquired when he saw my reaction. "So, what did you notice?" I noticed a man standing against a wall, and my intuition told me there was an important clue here. Jiro inquired as to what the person was up to. He also told me that I could persuade the ghost to look for more information. I took a few steps forward because he had his back to me and I couldn't see clearly. As I got closer to him, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. He had a large, deep cut on his neck. He was most likely slashed to death. Jiro was eager to find out what the man was up to. I stood there for a while but saw nothing. The man just stood there staring at the wall, doing nothing. Officer Jiro appeared to sense something, so he approached the wall, leaned over, and began to investigate. It was a brick wall, and Police Officer Jiro groped through every crack in search of something. Then he stopped. His palm was resting on a brick. Jiro exclaimed with glee that there was a special brick in here. He discovered that particular brick based on his experience. He snatched the brick with his hand and yanked it out. I noticed a hole in the wall and leaned forward, curious to see what was inside. Jiro reached inside and carefully removed whatever was inside. It was revealed to be a lottery ticket. We're both curious as to why there was a lottery ticket hidden inside this wall. Jiro took a closer look and stated that he had discovered a motive for the crime. "Surely this lottery ticket won and the killer murdered the victim's family as a result," said Jiro. He then went out right away and he appeared to be able to track down the murderer. I dashed after him to the car. Jiro now looked to be very confident as he drove to the end of the corner. I was curious, so I asked Jiro where he was going next. Jiro then asked if I had seen a lottery ticket agent when I first came into this area. Because the lottery ticket had the dealer's address printed on it, Jiro decided to apprehend the killer here. I went into the store with Jiro. The owner was a middle-aged man who welcomed us warmly. Jiro was asked by the owner if he had come to buy tickets or redeem prizes. Jiro stated that he came here to redeem the prize and reached into his pocket to take the lottery ticket. He held the lottery ticket up to the owner. When the owner saw the lottery ticket, he was immediately perplexed and terrified. Police Jiro summoned a colleague and took the murderer to the police station. Because he wanted to steal the winning lottery ticket, he murdered the victim's family, but he still couldn't find the ticket. He was driven away by a police car. Jiro expressed his gratitude to me. Jiro then took a taxi to take me home because he still needed to return to the police station to retrieve the killer's gun. I assisted him once more, as well as the dead, and working with the police was also a pleasure. By doing these things, I had changed my mind about my ability being bad luck. In a sudden, I was eager to call Mr. Zhu and tell him the story. I had done another good deed today. Mr. Zhu dispatched me to the countryside the next day to handle a demon-related case. I discovered Mr. Zhu was a very wealthy man. He even owned a luxury car. The fact that Mr. Zhu accepted me as a student made me very proud. I looked around the car and pretended to ask Mr. Zhu, This car is expensive, isn't it? So you think being a ghost catcher is the way to become very rich? Mr. Zhu asked while looking at me. I told him that the recent cases I had encountered had all been beneficial to the police, and Police Officer Jiro had also suggested that I open a shaman service, so I thought Mr. Zhu's advice. Of course, we need money to survive, and there are many people willing to pay a very high price, said Mr. Zhu. Mr. Zhu, on the other hand, quickly became more serious, stating that this profession was dependent on the situation, whether to receive money or to help others for free. He also made a lot of rules for himself. The idea was to only accept money from the wealthy and to help those in need without taking a single penny. I continued to converse with Mr. Zhu as the car drove into a village, which Mr. Zhu introduced as the village where he was born and raised. His grandson approached him for assistance. The car just arrived in the village when I noticed a man and woman waiting by the roadside. When he saw our car approaching, he quickly waved hello to us. It had to be Mr. Zhu's grandson. Mr. Zhu's grandson was in his 20s and full of energy. He dashed in front of the car to point us in the right direction. The car veered off the road and came to a stop in front of Mr. Zhu's grandson's house. Once inside, Mr. Zhu's grandson invited us to sit, and then he introduced us to his friend who needed assistance. His friend named Gang. Mr. Zhu stated that his face did not look good, so please tell him the entire story as soon as possible. Gang claimed that his house was haunted after a few words of courtesy. The workers were hurt while working on the house, but he didn't care because he thought it was just an accident. When the house was finished, the 3-person family moved in, and many strange things began here. They are sleeping in their beds at night. But when they opened their eyes, it was dawn. The odd thing was, they were all sleeping in the yard. And not just once or twice, but 3 or 5 times in a row. Gang was so terrified that he refused to move into the new house, so the entire family lived temporarily at his mother's house. Gang also found someone who knew about yin and yang, feng shui, and was told that the house feng shui was excellent. Mr. Zhu stood up after hearing Gang's story and stated that he would go to Gang's new home to have a look. I accompanied Mr. Zhu and his grandson, follow Gang to his new residence. Mr. Zhu took a look around the house. I was not familiar with feng shui, and I was not sure what he was looking at. It was just a regular tile house in my opinion. Mr. Zhu kept an eye on the house and confirmed what Gang said. That house has good and positive feng shui. But then he turned around and said sternly, feng shui is good, but it's very strange. Mr. Zhu still had the impression that there was a yin inside, and this had only recently occurred. Underneath this house, there are dead people buried, Mr. Zhu said abruptly. Gang detected a hint of understanding, but did not dare to express it. Mr. Zhu pointed out that Gang's Yang house was built on the foundation of someone else's Yin house. Did you come across any graves while digging the foundation for the house? Mr. Zhu abruptly inquired of Gang. Then he assured Gang that he would assist him in resolving the problem, and he instructed Gang to prepare some necessary items. Mr. Zhu also mentioned that we would be staying in his house tonight. Mr. Zhu's grandson and Gang left after they finished talking. When Mr. Zhu opened the door to Gang's house, I removed my glasses. I thought I saw something in Gang's yard, but there wasn't anything there. That night, Mr. Zhu told me to make up the bed, that he would act as bait, and that I would be tasked with using an important weapon. I was curious and wanted to ask him what it was. Mr. Zhu simply laughed, saying, "You'll know when it's delivered, just wait patiently." Just a few minutes later, Mr. Zhu's grandson opened the door and walked in, claiming to have prepared what Mr. Zhu had requested. I couldn't see what he was holding, but the stench of feces and urine filled my nostrils. I covered my nose and turned around to see him enter with 2 buckets of feces and urine in his hands. Mr. Zhu could clearly not stand the odor, He said,
"Oh, you leave it outside."
"Kang, you are going to learn how to catch ghosts with these 2 buckets tonight," he added. Mr. Zoo's grandson was taken aback, but he didn't dare to ask any more questions, simply putting the 2 buckets outside. I was taken aback when I asked Mr. Zoo how to use those 2 waste buckets. He immediately told me to stick to the plan and to teach me how to catch ghosts. I couldn't sleep at midnight because I was so nervous. Mr. Zoo appeared to be sleeping soundly. After a while of lying down, I heard him snoring loudly. Suddenly I heard the door creak and a gust of cold air blew in. Because I didn't wear glasses, I saw 2 people walk in through the door. I remained motionless as planned, glancing around to see what those 2 ghosts were up to. They hovered in front of him, making angry faces at Mr. Zoo and me. Mr. Zoo purposefully lied down on the outside of the bed in order to entice those 2 ghosts. They lifted him out of bed, just as Mr. Zoo had predicted. We were waiting for them to bring Mr. Zoo out. I immediately sat up and ran out the door. I probed, watched, and eventually found them in the yard. I saw them put Mr. Zoo on the ground, muttering as if cursing, but I couldn't understand what they were saying. I took advantage of the fact that they weren't paying attention and dashed out of the room, grabbing 2 waste buckets at the door. All of this was part of Mr. Zoo's plan. He acts as a distraction for them, and I acted from behind. I approached them on a tiptoe, making as little noise as possible. I dashed off to place a bucket on a ghost's head. Because the old ghost didn't prepare in time, I caught him. In other words, the bucket worked, sucking him inside. When I succeeded, I didn't waste any time and swam over the other ghost with the remaining bucket. 2 old ghosts were caught in 2 buckets in an instant. They struggled and protested relentlessly inside the buckets. I bent down and pressed hard because I was afraid the bucket would be overturned and they would run out. But when I pressed one down, the other vibrated and I tried to hold it down too. I felt a huge force in these 2 buckets and it clicked. A constant stream of black gas was coming out of the gap. When I saw a golden light hit the bucket as it was about to fall off, I was stunned. It turned out to be a yellow talisman. It was Mr. Zoo and he sealed the 2 buckets with 2 yellow talismans. The buckets then stopped moving. Mr. Zoo exhaled a sigh of relief and stated that everything was going well and that he had suppressed 2 old ghosts. Mr. Zoo examined the 2 buckets and questioned the 2 ghosts inside when he heard a sound that seemed to come from a very open place. Their voices could be heard as angry as well as pitiful. The elderly couple one by one stated that this was their home and that no one was permitted to enter. After they had finished speaking, Mr. Zoo stated that Feng Shui in their underworld had long been broken, and he also offered to assist them in locating a suitable location for the tomb. When the elderly couple learned of Mr. Zoo's abilities, they both agreed to move the grave in 3 days. Mr. Zoo then reached out and tore the yellow talisman from the bucket, and when the talisman separated from the bucket broke and a plume of black smoke erupted from it. Soon black smoke gathered in front of us, forming the ghosts of an elderly couple. Finally, Mr. Zoo inquired them as to where their ashes were interred. The elderly couple went to the base of the courtyard wall and vanished, implying that this was their final resting place. Everything went smoothly, and Mr. Zoo told me to go home and sleep. But I wasn't in the mood for sleep, so I went straight down to the well steps, only smelling urine and feces in my hands, afraid I wouldn't be able to wash it off for a while. Mr. Zoo's grandsons and his friend Gang arrived early in the next morning, relieved to see that Mr. Zoo and I were safe. Then, Mr. Zoo told them what had happened the night before. I called the company to request a break and stayed there because I agreed to transfer the bones in those 3 days. According to Mr. Zhu's advice, Gang dug up some bones at the base of the east wall on the 3rd day and discovered the bones in a large jar. Mr. Zhu chose a suitable cemetery on the mountain behind the village and asked Gang to bury the jar containing the remains of the elderly couple. A grave was built, and Gang, his wife, and their children came to worship. Mr. Zhu told Gang that every Tet they have to worship the couple, and when everything was finished, Mr. Zhu asks Gang and his grandson to go back first, and he would take me to the mountain. Mr. Zhu was in a good mood, so he invited me to stay with him for a few days to unwind. "This time, I will teach you some things, so study well," he said. I believed it was a wise decision to follow Mr. Zhu here. This location would provide me with numerous opportunities to demonstrate my abilities. The story happened when Mr. Zhu returned to his hometown. At this time, the opportunity was available, so he took me along to solve some strange incidents that occurred in the village. Mr. Li, a friend of Mr. Zhu, had a serious problem. Today, he invited Master Zhu to help him exorcise. Mr. Li's family didn't look so good right now. During the conversation, Mr. Zhu talked about Mr. Li's family situation. He said that Mr. Li's family was previously considered wealthy in the village. In addition, Mr. Li had a son named Kanji. He didn't go to school but still made a lot of money. However, when it came to his son, Mr. Li sighed. Right after listening to Mr. Li, Mr. Zhu was also a bit surprised and asked why. Mr. Li said that his son joined the village's labor team to reclaim crops. Kanji and a few guys in the village worked together to do this. At work, when Kanji was happily chatting with everyone, suddenly he shoveled hard on the ground as if he touched something. After that, a cloud of black smoke rose from the ground. Before Kanji could figure out what was going on, black smoke enveloped him. He quickly passed out. He fell to the ground and lost consciousness. Some people spotted Kanji and they quickly took him home to rest. After a few hours, Kanji slowly woke up. People thought that because Kanji had a sunstroke, he fainted. But it was strange. When Kanji woke up, he didn't even know who the people were in front of him. His friends felt very surprised. They touched his head to see if he still had a fever and why he couldn't remember anything. Kanji suddenly appeared annoyed. He stood up and showed a very condescending attitude. He appeared to be a stranger to everyone, even though his friends were very worried. Not only that, but he also chased them out of the door with a broom. At this point, Mr. Li saw that and stopped him. Unexpectedly, Kanji didn't even know who his biological father was. From that day on, everyone in the village thought Kanji was crazy. He locked himself in his room all day, didn't brush his hair and didn't wash his face, didn't eat or drink, and just wrote and drew strange poems. He had been able to write poetry since he was mad. Regardless of whether it was on the wall or the ground, he wrote poems and calligraphy. Once Mr. Li brought him food accidentally, Mr. Li stepped on a poem lying on the ground, which made Kanji very angry. Kanji picked up a wooden stick in the house and hit his old father. Not only that, whenever Kanji went out and met someone, he would raise the stick to hit them. To prevent his son from going out and causing trouble, Mr. Li had to lock Kanji in the house every day. After hearing Mr. Li's story, Mr. Zhu asked him to take them to see how Kanji was doing. Mr. Li took Mr. Zhu and me to the warehouse where Kanji was being locked up. Mr. Li also told us to be careful. Mr. Zhu walked to the locked door and looked into the window. The room inside was very dirty. On the walls and the floor were poems with calligraphy that were written by Kanji. He was reading a book with his hair disheveled. Mr. Zhu watched for a while and then asked me to take off my glasses to see what was inside. I took off my glasses, looked inside, and as expected, a man was wearing a traditional costume with pigtails behind. The strange man looked at me with angry eyes. Maybe the ghost discovered that I could see him. I told Mr. Zhu what I had seen. He believed that a scholar of the Qing dynasty usurped Kanji's body. The scholar's bones must have been dug up when the ground was leveled. Mr. Zhu saw the problem but did not solve it immediately. Mr. Zhu thought that Kanji's body had been occupied by this scholar for too long. Mr. Zhu asked Mr. Li for more information about Kanji. According to Mr. Li, Kanji didn't sleep most of the day except at noon. Mr. Zhu suddenly realized that the ghost always clung to Kanji's body, and since the ghost couldn't endure the Yang Kui for too long, especially at noon, that was when the ghost broke free from Kanji's body. Mr. Zhu inquired about the situation and came up with a way to deal with it. Mr. Zhu sent me to his grandson's house to bring tools to use. He really wanted to deal with that ghost. Therefore, I did not dare to delay but ran to go immediately to get things Mr. Zhu asked Mr. Li to find a piece of Kanji's clothes and draw a spell on it. After that, Mr. Zhu gave me clothes and gave me careful instructions. I took those things from Mr. Zhu. After that, Mr. Zhu walked out of Mr. Li's house quickly. I packed up things and went back to Mr. Li's house. At the same time, I brought a stool and sat outside Kanji's room. I stared at Kanji's room. Before long, the midday sunlight would be at its strongest. The moment that Mr. Zhu said come, I stood up and went to Kanji's room to look inside. By this time, Kanji was fast asleep on the bed. Right after that, a ghost appeared from Kanji's body and was an ancient scholar. He had already left Kanji's body and walked straight out. The ghost instinctively rushed to the door. He actually went through the closed door and kept going. As the ghost left the house, Mr. Li and I went into Kanji's room and put on Kanji the clothes that Mr. Zhu drew charms on. At this moment, there was an explosion from the yard. I rushed to the yard to check. It turned out that the scholar ghost wanted to get out of the gate but was stopped by a great force. He tried to collide several times but was bounced back every time. It seemed that Mr. Zhu had sealed this door. After repeating this a few times, the ghost still couldn't get out of the gate. The ghost started to get worried. The ghost tried again and again but couldn't get out. He suddenly turned back towards Kanji's room. I followed the ghost into the room. He was trying to jump at Kanji right now, but the ghost was stopped by the talismanic clothes. Realizing the opportunity had come, I took out the enchanted coins from my pocket. Then I threw them at the ghost. The ghost was hit, screaming in pain. The ghost spotted me and rushed towards me. At that time, I had the weapon in hand. I had some experience fighting ghosts, so I was not scared anymore. I was ready to face the ghost. I clamped the coin between my two fingers and flicked him hard, causing him serious injury. I repeatedly flicked at the ghost. He ran around to dodge the attacks. Finally, with nowhere to hide in the house, the ghost ran out in the courtyard again. I closed the door and sealed it with the charm that Zhu had prepared in advance. The ghost collided back and forth between the gate and the door of the house. He couldn't get in or out, and the sun was already high, shining straight in and burning him. Under the fierce sun and high yang energy, in a moment the ghost screamed miserably. Then he turned into black smoke and spread around. And in the end, the ghost evaporated into air. When the black smoke dissipated, the door opened and Mr. Zhu entered. I saw a big talisman outside the door. It was Mr. Zhu who used to seal the door to prevent the ghost from coming out. I told Mr. Zhu that these coins were a powerful weapon and that I had defeated the ghost. I thought Mr. Zhu would give me some compliments, but he rushed into the room to check Kanji's condition. At this time, Kanji woke up. Then Mr. Li saw us out the gate. He did not know how to thank Mr. Zhu for saving his son's life. What Mr. Zhu said made me extremely proud. He did not take any salary but only instructed Kanji to try to live a good life so that Mr. Lee could be happy. On the way back, I once again expressed my admiration for Mr. Zhu from the bottom of my heart. I felt that Mr. Zhu was a respected teacher. Master Zhu said that I need to practice more to deal with many other types of demons. I quickly followed him and promised to practice harder while I stayed here. After helping the Lee family exorcise ghosts, I felt that I had to learn more to gain enough knowledge in exorcism. I found life in the countryside and the city completely different. When I walked on the street, seeing everyone greeting each other, it made me feel warm. An elderly aunt met me and asked me if I wanted to get to know her granddaughter. So I stammered shyly, and Mr. Zhu told me to take the time to get to know many people to help my personality be more open. Master Zhu couldn't help but laugh when he saw my confusion. That day, Mr. Zhu and I visited the house of his old friend. As we were chatting and walking past the house, a girl came out from the yard. She also knew about Mr. Zhu's reputation, so she called out to him. The girl said that her family had not been peaceful in the past 2 years. She wanted to ask Mr. Zhu, but he ignored her and just glanced at her house. Mr. Zhu said that he could not solve the girl's problem, then turned and left. His behavior made me feel strange. I walked for a while, then turned back to see the girl standing at the door and crying helplessly. I went with Mr. Zhu to his friend's house, and then I decided to walk around the village by myself. I walked leisurely along the street while passing a supermarket. I decided to go in to buy a gum. I took the gum and paid. As soon as I came out of the supermarket, a girl walked up to me. That was the girl who wanted Master Zhu's help a while ago. She also seemed to recognize me. We were walking when she suddenly stopped me and wanted me to help her. I disagreed with Mr. Zhu's indifferent attitude, so I asked her about the specific situation. Her name was Lana. She lived with 2 brothers and 1 sister, but 2 years ago they suddenly became weird. I decided to go to her house to have a look. If I could, I would help her or ask Mr. Zhu to help. She was so happy that she took me to her house. As soon as I stepped inside, I felt a very heavy aura covering me. When I entered the yard, I took off my sunglasses to see if I could see anything unusual. But looking around every nook and cranny of the yard, I saw nothing. Lana's house also had a backyard. I suggested going to the backyard to have a look. We walked around from the side of the house to the back of the house. There was an older man stacking piles of firewood there. He was Lana's father. When he heard that Lana invited me, he was very angry. He complained that Lana should not believe in ghosts and gods. Lana argued with her father. I was trying to relieve the tension when suddenly I heard something on the roof. I looked up and saw a piece of tile falling across from Lana's father's head. I quickly walked over and pushed him away. The brick fell to the ground and shattered. This scene also scared Lana and her father. I looked up at the roof and saw the ghost of an older woman standing on the wall looking at Lana's father with angry eyes. Lana blamed her father for not believing what she said. I immediately looked back towards the ghost, but the older woman's ghost was no longer on the wall. I didn't know where the ghost had gone. I followed their father and daughter into the house. Lana was so enthusiastic that I felt a little embarrassed. I asked in detail what she said about the strange things that happened in their house. When it came to this, Lana looked very sad. The eldest brother fell into the ditch and broke his leg while walking in the mountains. The second sister on the road was hit by falling bricks and injured. The third brother did not know why he rushed to the street to be crushed by the car. Lana felt that this was not an accident, but something caused. But her father insisted it was bad luck and told her not to believe in ghost stories. Lana recounted how she often dreamt of her mother appearing as if she wanted to tell her something. Lana said she often felt her mother standing next to her bed. Every time she wanted to see her mother, she all woke up and her mother disappeared. Lana said her mother died while she was in college in the city. Her mother died of a serious illness. I asked Lana where her mother had been in this house. Lana was stunned for a moment and then took me to where her mother had been. She did not live in the main house, but in the warehouse. This warehouse had also been unused and abandoned for many years. Her mother was bedridden and unable to take care of herself. It was not convenient for her two brothers to live together, so her older sister cleaned the warehouse and left her mother in it. Her mother's illness cost a lot of money, so the whole family gradually fell into poverty. Lana felt very guilty for not being able to take care of her mother during her college years. Suddenly I felt someone behind me. Looking back, I saw an older woman standing behind me. She seemed to be seeing me, hovering in front of me. This was the first time a ghost had stared at me like that. I didn't know what her intentions were, so I didn't move either. Then she went around behind me. I felt her coming into my body, but nothing special. Right after the older woman completely entered my body, I suddenly saw something in front of my eyes. There were 4 people, including Lana's father, 2 other men, 1 woman. Well, they may be Lana's brothers and sisters. They gathered together to agree on something. I only saw the picture but not heard the sound. After discussing and debating, they seemed to find the agreement and they stood around their mother. The one who dropped the brick was Lana's mother. The 4 looked at the older woman lying on the bed with malicious eyes. Lana's mother seemed to have lost her sanity. One of Lana's older brothers grabbed the pillow and pressed it against the old woman's face. The older woman didn't struggle. The people around her were crying. Lana's brother was shaking and putting his hand on the pillow, looking very painful. Suddenly there was a thunderclap. My mind returned to normal. The scene before my eyes disappeared. It was raining outside. Lana didn't know what was going on. She asked me why I was so stunned and remained motionless for a long time. I asked her again if she rarely visited her mother during university. At this time, Lana confessed that she had repeatedly asked to return to her hometown, but her father refused to agree. I didn't tell her what her mother showed me. Her family did something so sinful. That's why Mr. Zhu refused to help her. I got up and left Lana's house. As I walked to the door, I asked if her mother had caused a great burden on her family. Lana said that because of her mother's illness, her family was stuck in debt. Both brothers were over 30, but neither wanted to get married. Her ailing mother became a great burden on the family. She stood in the rain, crying in regret. She seemed to know there were a big secret that no one could tell. I didn't dare to tell the truth. I was just saying that the guilty had all been punished for their sins. Her mother was gone too. Perhaps her mother had eliminated the grudge and no longer held any resentment towards the family. I put on my sunglasses and turned to leave, leaving Lana alone in the rain. I met Mr. Zhu on the way back. He knew I went to Lana's house. I had always felt that Mr. Zhu had magical powers. After this meeting, I realized that right and wrong were difficult to judge. Mr. Zhu also thought that Lana's mother had gone because she had vented her resentment. It was pouring rain that day, seemingly crying for the poor ghosts.